Hello everyone and welcome to NUEnglish Hub. Today we begin Unit 1 of Literary Theory for BA 6th semester under the syllabus of Nagaland University. This lecture is extremely important because it builds the foundation for all the theories you will study later, such as Marxism, feminism, structuralism, and post-colonial theory. Today's class will cover the concept of the East and the West, the power, language and representation, state and culture, alterity, and we'll also be discussing what is literary theory and what are new criticism and Russian formalism. I will explain these concepts using examples from Naga society and culture so that they feel relatable and easy to understand. Now let's look at the background concepts, the concept of the East and the West. The idea of the East and West is not just geographical, it is ideological. Historically, the West presented itself as modern and rational, while the East was portrayed as traditional and backward. This became stronger during the colonial rule, where the West usually had the power advantage over the East. Therefore, the portrayal of the East was always portrayed as traditional and backward because the power rested with the West. For example, communities in Northeast India, including Nagaland, were often represented by outsiders as primitive, exotic, and isolated, but from within, Naga society is community-based, culturally rich, and historically resilient. This teaches us an important point, that literature shapes how cultures are seen. If outsiders write our story, our identity can be simplified. Therefore, literary theory helps us to question such portrayals, especially in literature. Power, language, and representation. The concept of power, language, and representation starts with language if we understand that language carries power. The words used to describe people and places shape how others perceive them. For example, a Naga village can be described by an outsider as remote or traditional or culturally rich. Each description creates a different perception. For example, the word remote can be referred to something that is backward. The word traditional can be referred to something that is cultural, while culturally rich can be referred to something that is very exotic, which has a very positive connotation. Therefore, in literature, tribal life may be romanticized or may be shown as backward. These are, however, not neutral descriptions or say factual descriptions as they reflect power. The people in power controls the narrative in literature. Therefore, literary theory asks who is describing whom and from which position. The concept of the state and culture. Literature is shaped by institutions. In Nagaland, culture is influenced by church, education, community traditions, and oral storytelling. When oral stories enter written literature, they move from community space to academic space. Therefore, literary theory, with the concept of the state and culture, studies this movement, from how it moves from oral to written to institutional. The concept of alterity or otherness. Alterity means being seen as the other. Many students from Nagaland experience this outside the region when people assume Northeast is one single culture. Identity is therefore reduced to stereotypes. Literature often creates identity through contrast. For example, mainstream versus tribal or modern versus traditional. So, the word mainstream and the word tribal has two different meanings, and their meanings are further amplified by understanding the difference between the two. So this is what alterity is all about. Therefore, literary theory questions these divisions by asking who creates them and why. Now let us look at why these concepts matter, the concepts that we have been discussing earlier. Earlier, literature was studied for the story, the moral lessons, and author's life. But scholars began asking deeper questions. How does language shape meaning? How does society influence writing? And how does power operate in text? This shift from story to analysis led to literary theory. So therefore, literary theory studies how meaning is produced in a text. Now let us look at what is literary theory. Literary theory provides frameworks or lenses to interpret texts. It moves beyond summary. Earlier criticism asked, what does the author mean? And theory asks, how does the text create meaning? Theory studies language, structure, ideology, and representation. Therefore, in simple terms, literary theory can be defined as the systematic study of how literature creates meaning using language, culture, and ideology. Now let us look at new criticism. New criticism developed in England and America between the 1920s and 1950s. It reacted against criticism that depended on author biography, history of the author, and the emotion of the reader. It proposed that literature should be studied objectively. The major propounders of new criticism are T.S. Eliot, I.A. Richards, John Crowe Ransom, Clint Brooks, W.K. Wimsatt, where their main idea was focus only on the text. Therefore, they introduced close reading, which opined that analysis of any work or any literature can only be done by focusing only on the text. Therefore, they propounded the analysis of imagery, irony, paradox, and symbolism. Therefore, the text is created as a self-contained object, that the meaning of the text lies within the text itself. So therefore, while analyzing a work of art, the history of the author, nor the history of the era that the author has written in, is not taken into account, but rather on the language and the imagery that he has used in the text. This approach strongly shaped modern literary education. New criticism, therefore, can be defined as a 20th century critical approach that focuses on close reading and treats the literary text as an autonomous object independent of author and context. Russian formalism. Russian formalism developed in Russia between 1910 and 1930. It aimed to make literary study scientific. Instead of themes, it focused on the technique, the structure, and the language of the text. The major propounders of this are Viktor Shklovsky, Roman Jakobson, Boris Eichenbaum, and Yuri Tiranov. Their key ideas were literariness, that is, what makes literature different from ordinary language. They opined that in order to write literature, you need to use a certain type of language, following a certain technique, certain structure, and certain set of language. They also brought out the concept of defamiliarization, which was proposed by Viktor Shklovsky. It means presenting familiar things in unfamiliar ways so readers notice them deeply. For example, ordinary life in a Naga village described poetically becomes meaningful and fresh. For example, the sun can be referred to as an eye. Therefore, their concept of defamiliarization focuses mainly on the language that the writer uses. Therefore, the exam definition of Russian formalism can be defined as a study of literary devices and structure to understand what makes literature distinct from everyday language. Today, we learned literature shapes identity, language carries power, representation influences perception, Theory helps us analyze text critically. These are some of the things that are important for the exams. That is the definition of literary theory, new criticism, Russian formalism, defamiliarization, and names of key theorists. If this lecture helped you understand Unit 1 clearly, subscribe to NUEnglish Hub, switch on the bell notification, and comment which topic you want next. In the next lecture, we will begin a major paper of the BA second semester, Core 4 paper. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to comment. See you next time. Bye.